Anurag, we have another 5 minutes, so 4 minutes actually. So we'll wait. We'll wait for Mr. Chatterjee to join and then we'll start.
I
think Mr. Chatterjee is joined. Yeah, okay. Are we ready to go, Anurag?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Economic Diplomacy Division of the Ministry of External Affairs and the Confederation of Indian Industry to the session on developing clean technologies and green finance solutions for the Indo-Pacific. To begin with the session, I'd like to request Mr. Kaushik Chatterjee, Chairman CII National Committee for CFOs and Co-Chairman CII National Committee on Steel and Executive Director and Chief Financial Officer, Tata Steel Limited, to welcome everybody, set the context, and take the session forward. Over to you, Mr. Chatterjee. I think you're on mute. What happened? Yeah.
Can you see me? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. A very good evening to all of you.
We can't hear you, Mr. Chatterjee.
Give me a second, please.
I think some of us can. I just heard him all right.
You will need to unmute yourself.
Renuka, am I audible? I think we just heard Mr. Chatterjee all right. At least he was audible to us.
Yeah, we can hear him. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, and sorry for this technical glitch.
No problem.
Good evening to all of you, and welcome to this session on developing clean technologies and green finance solution for the Indo-Pacific. I'm joined by a wonderful panel of speakers this evening. Let me first introduce them before I make my opening remarks. Mr. Graham Pugh, Principal and Co-Founder, Propel Clean Energy Partners in the US. Welcome, Graham, to this session. Mr. Shrey Kohli, Director, Head of Debt Capital Markets and Funds, London Stock Exchange in the UK. Welcome, Shrey. Mr. Dhruva Purakayastha, India Director of Climate Policy Initiative and Director, US-India Clean Energy Finance in India. Good evening, Mr. Purakayastha. Mr. Shankar Pandey, Director, Bankers Institute of Rural Development in India. Mr. Pankaj Sidhwani, Chief Business Officer, Tata Cleantech. Mr. Prabodha Acharya, Chief Sustainability Officer, JSW Group in India. Mr. Deepesh Shah, Head Development and International Relations, International Financial Services Authority in the GIFT City in India. And Mr. Srinivas Jain, Executive Director and Chief of Strategy, SBI Funds Management Private. And last but not the least, Mr. Anirban Ghosh, Chief Sustainability Officer of the Mahindra Group. So thank you for joining us in this panel. I would like to make a few opening comments. Climate change is a stark reality for the whole world. In some ways, climate change is similar to COVID pandemic in being a global issue which needs a global response. Nobody is safe unless everybody is safe. We are all aware that the present technological and business models aren't sufficient for keeping the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or meeting the Paris NDC goals by 2030. The Indo-Pacific region contributes a significant amount to climate change, being home to one of the world's most populous and the fastest growing economies. The Indo-Pacific is also home to some of the world's most vulnerable land masses. Extreme weather events and rising sea levels are a real threat to 1 billion people and may even wipe out many cities and affect many nations very deeply. It is increasingly clear that governments and the private sector in all industrial nations will have to work jointly to come up with solutions on balancing economic growth with environmental sustainability. Given the enormity of the challenges, we will have to move to incorporate benchmark behaviors and best-in-class practices at a relatively rapid pace to facilitate a transition to a low-carbon future. We don't have too much time on our hands. The major focus so far has been on reporting and disclosures, but this is no longer sufficient. Clean technologies have the potential to become game changer in cutting down emissions while also incubating new economic sectors and generating employment opportunities. So there is a risk and there's also a huge opportunity for business. But even in hard to abate sectors, we need to explore that where hitherto it was expensive or difficult ideas, as the changing regulation and regulatory and business landscape may render many of these more realistic and mainstream. At the same time, we are also aware that the costs of many of these technologies are still prohibitive and implementation on very large scale is still unproven. In a relatively free trade environment, policy prescriptions also have to be nuanced. The decarbonization transition needs to address the needs of the society and must be implemented with care, sensitivity, and an appreciation for the needs of the local communities are very, very important. It is critical, therefore, to understand that historically, emissions by developed countries are responsible in large part for the excess carbon emissions globally today. This certainly puts moral pressure and responsibility on the global north to provide multilateral funding to global south for this transition to happen in a cost-effective manner, including in investments in affordable technologies and public policy changes. McKinsey says Asia alone has to invest $1.7 trillion a year in infrastructure for abatement and adaptation. Unaided, national or international governments cannot mobilize such money. This is a region which actually imports capital, and therefore it's a shared responsibility to move ahead on a joint basis. Financial innovations also have a huge role to play in incentivizing and encouraging the right behaviors for business and countries. It is also clear that interest in green financial instruments has exponentially increased in the last few years, with several investment houses setting up dedicated or specialist funds. Globally, it is expected that this will be a $1 trillion market in the next 2 to 3 years. Several international forums are today engaged also in establishing uniform benchmarks for reporting, measurement, and definition, and putting a framework for defining what is actually green. At the same time, it is clear that the conventional green bonds cannot become the sole source of capital for the transition to a decarbonized global economy. Governments and multilateral financing have a very important role to play in supporting private investments in this transition. I would like to conclude my opening remark by saying that this is a very important subject for all of us in the Indo-Pacific. It is important to recognize the potential, therefore, of the partnership. Frontier economies have a very high potential for mitigation with lucrative returns on green investments. Advanced economies are well positioned to benefit both from the supply of expertise and technology as well as capital. We have to remember that climate change is now become everyone's business. With that, I would conclude my opening remarks, and may I have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Graham Pugh for his remarks on the subject. Graham, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chatterjee, and thank you to CII for organizing this conference and inviting me to speak. I'm very pleased to be here with a session with such esteemed panelists. My name is Graham Pugh, and I'm a principal at Propel Clean Energy Partners. And today I'd like to speak with you mainly about a project we're supporting called the Clean Power Hub. And let me put this in context. The context for this conference is a focus on trade, yes, but also topics such as startups, digital transformation, and building back from COVID with resilient economies for a sustainable future. But as we look forward to that sustainable future, we know that cleaning up the power sector is extremely important. Mr. Chatterjee focused on the role that climate change will play and the importance of finance, which of course will be the topic of this session. I liked a few things that he mentioned. He talked about impacts, which we're aware of. He talked about the shortage of time. We need speed to address this challenge, but he also spoke about opportunity. So in order to focus on all of those topics, and in order to make progress on this issue, just to turn for a moment to the power sector, which is an extremely important part of the emissions and of course the economy, it's important to think about how it is that we make the changes that need to be made. And that requires work across a number of different sectors. It requires capacity, the ability to do the right things the right way, across policy and regulation and engineering, and of course, investment and project development. So how do we build that capacity? And that's something I'd like to have each of you listening to this today to think about is, how have you learned what you need to know? How will you learn what you need to know to invest in a clean economy and a sustainable future? So the Clean Power Hub is built on the premise that we can build that sort of capacity better in this digital age. So I'm going to share my screen and speak to the Clean Power Hub. So the Clean Power Hub, you can see the focus is on supporting the people driving the global clean power transition. It's managed by Propel with support from the Children's Investment Fund Foundation in the UK with support of National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Grantham Institute. And in thinking about how it is that you obtain the expertise you need in order to act, not just to learn, but to act in your own aspect of your business and your life, think about how you've learned. And we've focused on really two main ways that people acquire the information they need. One is you can hire a consultant or you can have technical assistance. If you're a government entity, maybe you have some bilateral or multilateral aid. In general, in the policy world, they call this capacity building. And typically that's a good way to get high quality expertise. It's often action oriented, of course, especially in the business world. You want to do something, right? You're investing in the consultant. You want to do something afterwards. That material can be tailored to clients' context and needs. But the problem is there's limited global capacity. If you're talking about all of the nations and all of the various parts of the various sectors that need to make the changes that are necessary, there just aren't enough of these experts to go around. They're very expensive. And the client really needs to know what they need, right? Often, if you've just heard something about sustainability and the green economy, these are buzzwords, but what is it that you actually need? And now, as we all know, COVID has impacted this model. Travel has been limited. Workshops may not be allowed. I mean, a good thing is that we've been able to have virtual workshops like this, virtual conferences, where we have sometimes even larger numbers of people participating than the conferences in person. The pause caused by COVID has given us time to think about new approaches, and maybe we'll modify those approaches going forward to be less expensive and less carbon intensive. So another way of thinking about how to make progress is knowledge hubs. And I think we all have some experience of knowledge hubs. They pack a lot of knowledge into one space, and you can often get that knowledge at various levels, maybe from some general information to more in-depth. But again, it can be challenging for users to find and navigate. How do they know what they need? And often these are academically oriented. There many times for students, they may be giving you information, but they're not telling you what to do, right? They need to be action oriented. They're not often tailored to the particular needs of the context in different governments. The Clean Power Hub right now is tailored to work in Southeast Asia, although the content is generally applicable. But in many of those economies, you have completely vertically integrated power sectors, right? Very different than the situation in India with state-run power sectors and regulations that can vary from state to state, although there are some centrally governed aspects as well. And the last thing is that these hubs rarely offer access to peers or experts for next step. You can read about something, but what if you need to talk to somebody? So with the Clean Power Hub, we decided to try to marry these approaches. Let's take the best international expertise on clean power and combine it with the latest innovations in online knowledge sharing. And we want to identify the biggest problems that people face in integrating clean power into their power systems, and then curate existing resources to create practical how-to guides, action-oriented guides, and provide content connections to peers and experts. And so I'm not going to show you the website. It's cleanpowerhub.net. You can go there yourself and see these things. So I don't need to walk you through it, but I want to highlight 4 aspects today. I mentioned the guides. These are step-by-step guides on various aspects of clean power. We're building them out as we speak. We have 5 guides available now and more are on the way. When we say how-to guides, these are essentially work plans. How is it that you plan for integrating more clean power in a power system? How is it that you operate a power system with higher shares of renewable energy? But beyond the guides, we have a community forum and a peer network so people can interact with each other. We have some tailored professional development and executive education courses. And here I'll give a shout out to CII, which has been offering a course on corporate purchasing of renewable energy with Imperial College under the auspices of the Clean Power Hub. It's been very well subscribed and is an excellent course. And finally, we have an Ask an Expert service, which is a means for people to pose their questions to an expert. Will actually match them with somebody who has expertise in the field of their question, and they can get free short-term technical consulting services, up to 40-50 hours of such services, assuming, of course, they have a real need and are going to take action after getting that assistance. So let me just focus on a few insights and then I'll wrap up. Technical assistance needs to stick. We have too many webinars and workshops and reports without the follow-on dialogue and interaction. And practitioners need to engage and to act. So any platform must support and encourage that. And of course, as Mr. Chatterjee said, there's a need for speed and innovation to achieve this kind of action. And the current approaches are too slow to address both the development and climate challenges. And I would argue, though, that of course, innovation plays a critical role, the immediate need in the coming years is less for innovation in technologies and more for innovation in driving the changes necessary to adopt current technologies faster. We have technologies that can make a tremendous difference today. We can get ahead of the challenges we have while we innovate to lower costs and improve technologies. Finally, let me just say something briefly about the model of the Clean Power Hub. We have a platform. The platform can take the content from expert organizations and we can lay it out in this way and provide these services and then reach to the practitioners who need it. And again, practitioners from all of these sectors that are involved in clean power. And where does support for this come from? This is from philanthropic and regional support organizations, people who know of the needs. They have convening power. CII is a great example, has convening power to bring us all together. We can get funding from various organizations and we take that expert content, package it in this format, get the right experts involved, and then put that in front of the right practitioners. So I encourage you to check out the Clean Power Hub. I encourage you to register on the forum and communicate with one another. And thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, Graham, for giving us the insight on the Clean Power Hub. And it certainly is very interesting, and it takes us to the real world beyond, as you rightly said, the webinars. Where does the rubber hits the road? And I think thank you very much for your insight. And I'm sure many of us will take the liberty of getting more details and access on what the Clean Power Hub initiative is taking us through. Thank you very much.
And I should say it's all free.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time and for your comments. May I now request Mr. Shrey Kohli, Director, Head of Debt Capital Markets and Funds, London Stock Exchange Group in the UK, for his comments on the subject. Shrey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chatterjee, and thank you to the CII for inviting us to present at this prestigious event. The CII is not only the Confederation of Indian Industries, but has the captains of Indian industries. So as one of the world's largest global financial markets, which allows for the raising of capital to causes like funding the low carbon and just and equitable transition, as you mentioned, Mr. Chatterjee, we're very keen and happy to present today. So I thought in my few minutes, it would be useful to present a few perspectives. One, what is happening within global financial markets on the subject of ESG. And as Graham mentioned, green finance and ESG financing is more of a catchphrase, but if I could add a catchword, if I could add a buzz phrase or a catchphrase, I think we're increasingly seeing ESG as BAU. Environmental social governance as business as usual because of the intensity of the climate crisis we face across the world. Secondly, I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that the LSE is doing, including the London Stock Exchange's sustainable bond market, which has seen a number of Indian issuers tap capital for sustainable finance purposes, including clean tech and across the Asia Pacific. And finally, a few comments on the low carbon transition. So to start off on the global perspective, so if you look at debt finance in its entirety, sustainable bond markets, including green, social, and sustainability bonds, and now sustainability-linked bonds, are $1.5 trillion of outstanding credit. Now that's in an annual issuance cycle of about $15 trillion every year, or $100 trillion of debt which is outstanding. So it's a small part of markets, but an increasing part of markets. The issuance has increased from 40 billion in 2014 when the LSE set up its green bond segments to about $500 billion last year. And this year in 2021, the capital raise has already exceeded the capital raised in 2020. So in 6 months, we've seen more sustainable capital raised than the entire of 2020. There are $35 trillion of funds in fund management industry globally, tagged and linked to ESG. And over $100 trillion of funds which are within the UN principles for responsible investment. So it is ESG as BAU. And increasingly, if a company, let's say within the power sector, is looking at financing itself with 50-year debt, a very credible question to ask is, what is your mix of funding of power sources within the next 50 years? Are you moving away from highly intensive sources of carbon to more renewable sources of energy? But there is a problem. And the problem is we have 51 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that we need to net out to zero. And as Mr. Chatterjee said, I think the pathways across the developed world and the developing world will be different to balance trajectories related to economic development and the climate crisis. And this is something at the London Stock Exchange, we're very, very conscious. So you have to look at a certain number of industries. And let's say 4 sectors are key. One is power, one is transport, one is manufacturing, and the final one is heating and cooling, especially with the scale of the climate crisis that we're seeing, in Delhi right now. I hear from my parents it's 45 degrees and it's impossible to be in a room without an air conditioner. And each of those sectors have traditionally not been that active within green bond markets because, quite rightly so, the way with which they perform business is carbon intensive. So there is the need and the challenge for these industries to transition to models which are different. And I'm very keen to listen to the various speakers on this panel about the strategies that they're seeing within their spaces. And the second problem is within India, this year there's only been $4 billion of green bonds being issued. Now, $4 billion is twice the amount that was seen previously, but it still is a small share. So I think in terms of awareness, with entities with convening power like the CII, the London Stock Exchange is very keen to work with your membership to help create understanding and awareness of how you articulate sustainability strategies to investors and pivot business models towards lower carbon trajectories in the future. So to talk a little bit about the LSE's work, we do focus on data and disclosure, helping companies provide the right information to investors so that they can make active choices within their portfolios as to whether they include them within a selection strategy or within passive strategies. We create benchmarks. So with the Brunel partnership in the UK, as well as with the Church of England Pensions Board, we've created an index which tilts companies based on the quality of disclosure that they provide, as well as their carbon trajectories over the next 20 to 30 years and Paris alignment. We support the green economy through markets like the sustainable bond market, which allows international companies to raise financing through green bonds, social bonds, and sustainability bonds. And we're very pleased that through the sustainable bond markets, we have hosted the first milestone issuances from the Asia-Pacific, including a green bond from Fiji, a sovereign green issuance from Hong Kong, the first certified green issuances from India, which included SBI and previously Yes Bank, the first from the Middle East, including Qatar and Egypt, the first from Africa, including Nigeria, and the first from the Americas, including Mexico and Chile. So this is a 24-hour market. And finally, we work with issuers on their low carbon transition strategies. And I think this is an interesting segue into the rest of the panel, so I'll try and summarize over here. I think the goals of the Paris Agreement are challenging for the entire world to meet, and there is a recognition that pathways across different industries and different countries will be different. But the reality of the situation is that the sectors which have been less active within green finance markets have to figure out science-based strategies to pivot business models to a low carbon world. And we started seeing green shoots. So for example, in India, the cement industry through Ultratech Cement was the first issuer to issue a sustainability linked bond, looking at its greenhouse gas emissions footprints in the medium to long term. We're quite keen that this is replicated in the power sector, looking at the mix of energy sources, or within the steel sector, looking at green hydrogen and lower carbon coke as responsibilities for enriching steel. Because the fact of the matter is India's infrastructure needs are not going to change, but the way that you fund those needs to sustainable infrastructure is the way that we build back better post-pandemic. So to end my remarks, as Graham mentioned, you can find us on LinkedIn and you can find us on londonstockexchange.com/SBM, that's Sustainable Bond Market. Please do provide us with your contact details, and if we can have a follow-up conversation with you about your funding plans, we'd be keen to work in partnership with entities like the CII and the exchanges in India. Thank you very much, Mr. Shah.
Thank you, Shrey, for a very insightful and informative session, and your points on the size of the green bond market and the sustainability bonds being a very important source of greening the balance sheet for companies, especially in the hard to abate sector. I think India has just made taken its baby steps in that direction, and given the issue at hand, I'm sure more and more companies will access the platform that London Stock Exchange provides in terms of investors and the depth of the market and the liquidity of the market. I think reporting and disclosures have also been very important. And I think we'll come back to it in possibly in some of the Q&As. And fundamentally, the stability of the financial system globally is very much depending on the pace at which we can provide capital to the underlying transition of companies who have to or who are looking at the low carbon transition in the future. So thank you very much, Ray. We will come back to you on questions at the later part of the program. May I now invite Mr. Dhruba Purokayastha, the India Director of Climate Policy Initiative and Director, US-India Clean Energy Finance, for his comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chatterjee, and good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you, CII, for inviting me over in this important session. We work at Climate Policy Initiative. We are a US nonprofit focused on working on the space of climate finance. But let me use my few minutes here to draw attention to the 4 points that I noted from Mr. Chatterjee's initial address. And I would address these 4 points within this time. One, Mr. Chatterjee, you said about green growth, which is about balance between growth and sustainability. You spoke about low carbon trajectory with hard to abate sectors. Steel happens to be one of them. You also spoke about emissions from part 1 countries have created the problem, and therefore this is a global public good, needs to be addressed in a fair manner. And finally, you also mentioned about a financial sector as to how to increase finance flows to clean technologies, new technologies, or green finance, which was also referred to. So let me take this opportunity and talk about each of these 4. Green growth is the balance that you mentioned. In a post-COVID world, we see even the Pacific region who are members of this association or a loose association that we have created. There's a combination of part 1 and part 2 countries and many middle income and some low income countries too. Permit me to take the example of India, because ultimately for the world to get it right, India needs to get this right. Otherwise the world does not meet its targets. So that's the scale at which India is operating. Yes, I would include Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, and China, of course, but India needs to get it right. So if you look at the post-COVID context, see, if we can think through of how recovery could be green, India is faced with a reverse migration today. And if you look at people, India was possibly 25% or 23% below the poverty line. Post-COVID, it will cross 30%. So what we are talking of is, and if you look at agriculture, it used to support 60% of the workforce. It will probably support even more. So here comes the play of clean energy, distributed clean energy as a space in which I work in as far as India is concerned. And these technologies are available. These technologies of lower scale, of storage, of conversion, whether it is hydro, whether it is solar, whether it is mini grids, whether it is solar home lighting systems, these are available. India is connected to the last mile. So we don't have a grid problem. The question is, we do not have the systems in India to generate in a distributed manner and take the clean energy. Rather, we have centralized grids and utilities, and that is getting covered. Because why doesn't that work? Because you have to cover for the inefficiency of the grid. So that's the case in India. Clean technologies deployed in a rural non-farm economy will create jobs that will sustain growth, because agriculture may not support it, and you have a reverse migration from urban to rural in India. So this is a case in example. This is probably affect many other countries. So this is how you could balance, try and think about green recovery, where both technology can be applied both for creation of jobs and creation of output. So that is the distributed clean energy. And many technology transfer should be possible. It needs scale. If it cannot be scale, it needs replicability. Replicability can be provided. And there are part 1 technology countries in this association who can provide that technology, whether it's storage or miniature clean energy, clean solar energy generation. We come to low carbon trajectory for hard to abate sectors. And I think Shrey also referred to some of these. Yes, there is a point over here. Steel happens to be one of the hard to abate sectors. Again, there is technology available, but there is a price to abatement of that. See, there is low hanging fruit on technology on one side, which is the emissions part, which is the efficiency part of it, which doesn't cost much, which is the cooling, the HVAC, the lighting, the prime movement, the motors. And there is on the other side, which is hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. So there is a difference, but the potential for that abatement is very, very high. If you look at hydrogen, if you look at carbon capture and storage, and yes, even in a steel industry, it's possible, theoretically possible to replace reducing agent from coking coal to hydrogen, but that comes at a huge price. Somebody needs to pay for that price. Now that leads me to the third point that you made. As far as emissions, India stands on this level of common but differentiated responsibility, and so does many parts of the world. Without getting into a complicated negotiation of the Paris Agreement, the common understanding, if we believe in science and science-based targets, this needs to be done. This is an imperative. And if this is an imperative, carbon emissions and mitigation needs to be priced. There is a value to the global existence for that price of carbon mitigated, and that needs to get monetized. If that were to get monetized, that is where we need the driving collaboration to be able to, between these countries, even the international protocols allow for this bilateral, multilateral possibilities of carbon pricing, which can be monetized. If India were not to do it, India would meet its non-NDC targets as committed to Paris as business as usual, as it was being said. India does meet it. But if India doesn't do more, then so if Indonesia doesn't do more as far as coal is concerned, then again, what was being talked of by Graham and Shrey, the issue is your energy transition is what Graham was mentioning does not happen. So in order to make that happen, carbon needs to be priced. So if that carbon needs to be priced and paid for, that leads me to the point that you made on the financial sector as far as flows of green finance is concerned. Now, if we are able to direct the price of carbon, get the price of carbon paid in an institutional mechanism and drive that price of carbon to the investor, and that is exactly where Shrey comes in terms of bonds, green financial instruments, green finance. There is an increased perceived risk. I can get into it in detail, but the time is too short. There is, as of now, still there is a higher perceived risk of growing green because the credit ratings do not really support a notching up or a better credit quality. That's not accepted as of now in financial markets, but it needs to change. In order for this to change, there is associations, there is NGFS, which India's central bank has also joined. But without getting into this, if carbon can be priced and this could be provided as a risk subsidy for the investor, for the lender, you're getting financial markets to work. I would stop here and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Purakash. You kind of very succinctly dealt with these four topics, and I think all the points that you made are very, very relevant, especially in the point of pricing of carbon. I think while we can grandstand and say that we will comply with our targets, but as I said, nobody is safe till everybody is safe. And it's not a race between countries and nations and societies. It's a race to zero. So I think that's what will make this world more livable. I think the financial markets have to start putting penalties on differentiated valuations depending on the efforts put in by companies and nations. And it's a matter of time, I think, carbon will start getting priced in countries like India, which will then provide the impetus and the nudge to move towards a solution. Thank you very much again. It was wonderful listening to you.
Thank you.
May I now turn to Mr. Shankar Pandey, Director, Bankers Institute of Rural Development in India. Shankar, may we have your comments, please?
Thank you so much. First of all, congrats to CII for organizing this wonderful Indo-Pacific Business Summit and also this session. thanks to chair of this session and the co-panelists. Well, I represent Banker Institute of Rural Development, which is a bankers training institute, but we also train a lot of, build capacities into a lot of other stakeholders too. And we are promoted by India's largest development finance institution called NABARD. NABARD also happens to be the national implementing entity for most of the green funds that are multilateral green funds that are there, GCF and Adaptation Fund Board and all that. BIRD also houses a climate change center for building capacities and other stakeholders. We also provide a lot of advisory services to other countries from our climate change center and some of our associate, NABARD companies as well, to help other countries, prepare themselves to access these funds from multilateral agencies. Well, I think no denying the fact that we must, time has come that we must embrace this clean technology and resource efficient and less carbon technologies, and must reinvent circular economy, probably which was already there in our traditions in India at least. But with the advent of modern technology, we forgot. We need to revisit all of them. Number two, for countries like India, which are vast, developing, I think because the task is humongous, I think we must prioritize sectors because we cannot act on all sectors together. And those should be high impact sectors, either those who are large proportion of economy, or they are going to affect large proportion of population. So obviously some candidates are power, transport, water, building, infra. But for developing countries and mostly Southeast Asian countries like India, I think agri and allied, micro and medium and small enterprises, and urban sector, urban waste management sector are huge candidates for, and priority candidates for, clean technologies. I think I would suggest three-pronged approach because it is not easy to, switch over to new things immediately. So first approach should be that we should have phased transition in certain sectors where technologies are there, but it is very difficult to change them overnight. So that should go on slowly. Then, of course, we should encourage disruptive technologies in certain sectors which are newer and where tested technologies are available and commercial viability is there. And we also need more comprehensive systemic transformational approach to the entire issue of clean technology and green finance. And for all these, I think underlying necessity would be that whatever we do must be commercially competitive. And therefore, this involves, an interplay between a large number of players. It is not one sector can do everything. And if one sector gets active, it will be done. I think it has to be interplay between all policymakers, the lenders, financial, debt market, technology institutions, because it has to be science-based, venture capitalists, local bodies, and civil society. And of course, the international collaboration has to be there. I think at the core of everything climate is, and in industrializing economies would be technology, the clean technologies. And I think huge investment needs to go into R&D, particularly in countries like India, where more appropriate technologies suiting to very small scale operation of decentralized sector in India has to be there. So that's, though developed countries may come up with, very advanced technologies, which are carbon efficient and all that, it may not necessarily suit countries like India, where scale of operation at unit level is very small in every sector. So in fact, the national government may have to come forward and maybe collaborate with international agencies and governments as well to come up with a framework where R&D for micro sector gets developed. And we have competent institutions like IITs and all, which are, par excellence, and we can do. In fact, certain clean tech initiatives, pilots, projects, centers of excellence, incubators have to sit in institutions like IITs and national laboratories and CSIR system, and we have many of them. And of course, in under system, we need to have regulation, protocols, system approach, where work has definitely well begun in larger sectors like transportation, power. I think we have got good framework in place, but it needs to touch many other sectors which occupies, large, maybe either polluting sectors or many people engaged in those sectors. Of course, financing mechanism, I think, as Dr. Chatterjee said, we are still taking baby steps, though green bonds have substantial volume in India, but still green financing has not taken place. I mean, it has not touched the heart of banks in India. My view is that unless we integrate clean technologies with entrepreneurship and employment generation and revenue generation in India, it is not seen as very lucrative proposition for either for big corporates or medium, small, and household level, enterprises to invest in these technologies, because they don't get enticed by, world green unless revenues are there, and they say competitive in their own business. Well, as I said, and these for lending agencies, also for banks and development agencies like NABARD and others, there could be certain, inhibitions in financing these because, in countries like India, environment is almost equated to public funding and not, borrowed funds. So these are not seen as commercial investments. So far, there are exceptions. There are good exceptions as well, and commercial projects have been funded. They are also long gestation, and returns are not measurable really. You cannot isolate returns on investment in clean technology separately from the mainstream commercials. They also may be having long gestation period, and they do not necessarily attract price premium in developing markets like India. So there are risks to lenders. Like typically banks would not be sure about technology, the business model, or policy, market, pricing. I mean, solar is one typical example in Indian market where contracts are getting cancelled because those were contracted at a very high price as compared to what it is today. So contracts are being renegotiated, and therefore it is not very attractive today for the lenders, mainstream lenders, and therefore we need certain mechanism like can there be, and it will definitely attract risk premium. So we should have something like some incentive from the government. Maybe we have typical mechanism called interest subvention from Government of India to many priority areas. So that can be brought in here. It requires some advocacy of the sector or climate activists with Government of India. As far as mainstreaming, climate financing or green financing in banks in India, because large banking sector in India is public sector, and government lays a lot of emphasis on public sector banks funding priority sectors in the country. But I think the work is yet to start in terms of green financing by Indian banks. Even to that extent, I would say that even central bank in India, that is Reserve Bank in India, is yet to take those first serious steps in prescribing something like SEBI has done. Our exchange has prescribed because green bonds have already been issued. But central bank for mainstream financing by banks is yet to come out with comprehensive guidelines, and that body of work is really required. Financing by banks start only when detailed guidelines are issued by central banks and their own corporate offices, and then only the end level financing where branches will start. Therefore, huge amount of work needs to be done, and these issues are identified as to what is to be done, because right from definition of what is green finance, how to identify that certain asset is green or not, and how to identify a portfolio which is green within banking portfolio, I think huge amount of work needs to be done. Then, of course, bank are going to charge risk premium on their green financing, because these are not mainstream technologies, models are not established, therefore perceived risk is going to be there. And therefore, again, some mechanism has to come up in this. And I would say that awareness among banks or even within central bank at this stage is not there. They're capable of developing, but initially very pointed advisors for banking sector for green financing are required. I mean, some set of people who are experts need to work with central bank as well as banking sector and institutions like IBA, which is Indian Banks Association. I think we need to work on this issue. I mean, there could be other stakeholders like NABARD, because whatever we do in NABARD is almost 60-70% is green. We fund projects which are essentially green, because we are National Bank for Agriculture, Rural Development, so most of them are green or can be termed as green. So some task force or advisors or bodies, experts, individuals need to work on it, and there has to be a discussion paper on this in public domain for commentary by Central Bank of the country. To end my opinion, I think I will put the last few points. I think there is huge pipeline of projects in India, but can we have a sub pipeline of green projects in each sector? I think that would be a starting point. And I think wherever green is required, most of the funding has to be in the public sector that governments will have to spend. But many governments are now coming up with hybrid projects which are not completely publicly funded, but there is public-private models are there, and banks are financing. I think these would be the best projects to begin with, where blended finance can take place, where not only government comes with their own money, then NABARD-like institutions can put, some of the international money can be Asian Development Bank and other monies. And of course, some of the borrowed monies or debt finance can come into this. I think we must deliberately identify, like government must deliberately identify and keep aside projects which have to become blended finance model for green financing. And for that, I would say that, GCF and GCF kind of agencies which have some trouble right now, but multilateral development agencies, these agencies have to, or IFC and World Bank, these agencies have to take some steps in this direction, that some of their funding can be made conditional, that it must be green and it must be blended finance. I think venture funding needs to be accelerated and expanded in this arena. There could be separate window for venture funding in climate finance. Of course, fiscal measures are required in terms of tax and duties. I think what would entice and attract private industry would be if some CSR concessions are given or credits are given, if they are investing in green technologies, some extra credit under CSR can be given to them. To that extent, their CSR spend would come down. And particularly under, many sectors are stressed after COVID, I think such measures are due now at this stage. So this can be a very pointed suggestion to government. I will again come back to my emphasis on prioritizing sectors like agri-allied informal and unorganized industrial sector in India, which is huge. Then small and micro sector, and also household sector, because of sheer population, that we have, and number of households that we have. They are huge consumer of everything, all natural resources. I think these sector may not ever get prioritized in international, science or economic or whatever. But for developing countries, I think these sectors are going to be huge impacting sectors. And if these sectors are, addressed, then the much of the, clean technology problem of India-like countries, developing countries, is going to be solved. Then, of course, can industry or government can come up with star rating of projects, which can be disclosed in, while debt raising, or even banks can give certain interest rate incentive if these are, star rated companies or projects or business houses. And government does invest a lot of money in terms of incentives for, sunrise or emerging sectors. So incentives have to be linked with, rating, the environmental rating of projects and sectors. Can we also have green ranking of financial institutions? How much of their portfolio is green, and can we rank, globally or nationally, which banks are green? I think that will set competition among financial institutions and banks to go green, to become more aware at corporate level, to bring in more specific policies, and so on. And then whether time is up to have, green finance watchdog. I mean, RBI typically does that, and they are in a position to impose a lot of penalty also. We have a beautiful mechanism called priority sector lending by banks, where 40% of their total net bank credit has to go to priority sector identified by Government of India and Reserve Bank of India. So we can, time has come to begin some limit for green financing under priority sector, I think. And finally, I think climate is not very easily understood by mainstream commercial bankers or investors. So it requires a lot of advisory and capacity building services. So we at BIRD definitely, through our Climate Change Center, we are making that effort. But I think more such effort are required right at corporate level to the employee level, to make them aware as to what green and clean means and how to approach these issues. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pandey. And obviously, you've kind of dwelled in depth on the capability building as far as the banking sector is concerned. And I think the fact that the risk and opportunities of the low carbon transition is not yet assessed fully is evident from the financial markets, at least. I think it's important for us to also understand that green financing cannot be seen in the same way as normal commercial bank financing. And that's where I think Shrey's point was earlier, that we have to look at it very differently. We have to look at reporting and disclosure requirements, assessment of projects. And I think the NGFS is the forum where central banks like RBI is a member of, because that's essentially a project or a platform for a network for greening the financial system. So I think it is important that the Indian banking sector, and you raise an important point for a role of IBA in this process. And I'm sure as members of IBA will look at how do you make the Indian banking system be alert to start thinking about greening their balance sheet, because only when banks start greening their balance sheet does the financing towards the bank financing towards greening becomes more real. So thank you very much. I would like to invite my next panelist, Mr. Pankaj Sidhwani. Chief Business Officer of Tata Cleantech. And in the interest of time for my panelists, I will request you to keep your comments to about, say, 6 to 7 minutes so that we can conclude the session eventually on the right time. Thank you very much. So Pankaj, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chatterjee, and thank you, CII, to have given me an opportunity to speak on a matter of such topical importance. Truth be told, I was not aware that Indo-Pacific region accounts for 64% of world population and 62% of global GDP. Now, it is therefore only natural that any sustainable, long-lasting solutions in our battle against climate change will find its origin in our efforts of collaboration, partnerships in this part of the world. It is a fact that climate change is the biggest threat the modern humans have ever faced. It is also a fact that Indo-Pacific region in general, and India in particular, will need to play a very important role in solving global crisis of this magnitude. However, we need to be cognizant of how our efforts at decarbonizing our economic growth intersect with the aspirations of hundreds of millions of young Indians. You are aware that India's per capita energy emissions are still amongst the lowest in the world, and more than 2/3 of our infrastructure is yet to be built. Let me bring in another dimension, which is India's vulnerability to the effects of climate change. Mr. Chatterjee also alluded to this in his opening remarks. So between 1970 and 2005, in about 30 years' time, India saw 250 extreme weather events. Since 2005, in about 16 years, we've had more than 310 extreme weather events already. So this average has gone up from 3 to as much as about 11 in a year. So effects of these changes in the microclimate now impact 75% of India's districts and are leading to loss of prosperity, livelihoods, and lives. Therefore, what choices does it present to us as a country? How can it meet challenges for its own population and for the world? What do these choices mean for the rest of the world? How can they help India transition and transform better? And I'm specifically using the word transform here. We'll try and answer these questions in just a bit. The first question is the choices for India. And the biggest silver lining I see is that India has the unique opportunity to build green infrastructure from scratch. Much of the infrastructure is yet to be built. And what better way to build it all green? Green infrastructure development will usher in growth and prosperity and bring in jobs without sacrificing green goals of the country or the world. Now, choices for the world. Why should India attract world's attention? Which other economies have the capacity to attract and absorb capital of this size is my first answer to that. India offers unprecedented scale. India is currently at about 95 gigawatt renewable energy. We are targeting 455 gigawatt. And I might, stand out as a contrarian here, but I can tell you within green, specifically within renewables, I think we are seeing this market being today's bias market. I don't know whether many of us have noticed. Yesterday, a bond issuance by Vector Green was underwritten at the pricing of 6.5%. GSEC is today priced at 6.18. So a renewable energy bond being underwritten at 6.5, where GSEC, government securities, at 6.15, of course, tenors are different. It shows how much confidence India's capital markets already have in renewable part of the green. And I can tell you same is happening in the banking industry today. We are a shadow bank, non-banking finance company. And I can tell you we are literally looking for good projects. Too much money is chasing too few good projects and margins have come down substantially. So there is no dearth of money today for good projects. And I'm not saying good projects mean the ones which offer collateral. I'm talking of non-recourse finance, the projects which have good counterparties like SECI or NTPC or have good contracts. They are easily finding money from both mainstream banks and financial institutions. Yes, our growth also has been dismal in the last 1 or 2 years. And once this pace of construction goes up, the real challenge will come in then. But at this moment, and even in the past, I can give you an example. India's renewable sector has attracted roughly about $70 billion so far. Much of this money is domestic. Hardly 20% of the money is foreign. So which means that India's banks, financial institutions, capital markets have reposed their faith in India's renewables markets at least. I'm not talking about the whole green because green is much more than renewables, but at least for the renewable part, there's been a great deal of confidence being demonstrated by Indian financial services markets. So this was about renewable energy, right? We are targeting 450 gigawatt. We are talking of e-mobility. All of this will require more than $1 trillion for sure. India will also require smart, modern transmission grid to be able to handle RE in such large parts, right? So that will also require hundreds of billions. People often talk about challenges related to informed nature of renewable energy because solar produces only once sun is shining, or wind is producing only once wind is blowing. So we are now seeing more bids for round-the-clock electricity or with storage. Staying on storage, we already have about 5 gigawatt of pump hydro capacity and a potential of another 96 gigawatt. Mini hydro, we have today capacity of about 46 gigawatt, another 12 gigawatt of potential. Let me come to corporates now. About 60 Indian corporates, and I think that includes Tata Steel as well, have announced their ambitions to turn net zero. To put this in perspective, global RE100 coalition requires more renewable electricity today than UK or Italy. So, that is a power of, corporates coming together and going green. Let me talk about green hydrogen. Green hydrogen mission is getting announced in next, few months. And as part of that, users of green hydrogen might be asked to switch to green hydrogen. India has offered thousands of crores worth of performance-linked incentives for green manufacturing in India, including that for battery storage. India's smart meters program envisages investments of over 30 billions. Right? India has undertaken world's largest LED bulb programs, which has already replaced more than 100 million bulbs. Right? Millions of inefficient energy guzzling pumps are being replaced with the solar pumps. Standard enabling program is expected to save roughly 3 billion units of electricity by 2030. So that is the kind of scale I'm talking about. Let me now turn to policy. Now, India's policy framework is proactive, predictable, and stable. And that gives a lot of confidence to the prospective investors. And it is a fact that today, specifically in renewable energy, you have all the biggies from the world, whether they are utility players like EDF and NG, or you have sovereign funds and wealth funds from Singapore, from Japan, from Canada, and elsewhere. They're all already invested in India. So it is already attracting a lot of investors. Much more needs to happen though. Institutions and governance system framework in India is quite strong. I must tell you to that as well. And most importantly, there is real money to be made. Returns for this kind of scale are still amongst the best anywhere in the world. And I'll give you our own example. TCCL is a joint venture of Tata Capital and IFC Washington. But this started as an experiment almost 8 years back. And I can tell you, we have offered industry-leading returns since its inception. Although our agenda is green, our agenda is developmental, our shareholder returns are better than commercial banks and financial institutions, right? And that is the reason we've also been able to attract investments from global DFIs such as Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, JICA of Japan, CDC, in addition to SMBC and others. So, let me now talk about challenges a bit, and then I'll come to solutions also. The biggest challenge is, the money supply right now is all okay. But as you also said, and some of the other panelists also said, India requires trillions of dollars, right? That kind of a money is not there in India. And that might, by some estimates, India will require 6 trillions for energy transition alone, right? Now, this looks like a very large sum of money, but pales in comparison with global GDP of about $85 trillion and global annual savings of about 20 trillion, right? So some part of that, if it moves to India, because India is solving problem, not just for itself, it is solving problem for the world also. 1/3 of emissions are being emitted from India, and therefore, rightfully so, 1/3 of global capital also needs to flow to India. So second is cost of capital is high compared to the rest of the world. Even with higher cost of capital, India delivered less than 3 cents a kilowatt hour of solar electricity. You can imagine what it can be if the cost of capital is lower. Right? Another point, and this, I think Shrey also alluded to it, capital markets in India are not wide and deep enough. Our over-reliance on banks and shadow banks need to be reduced because they do not have matching liability profiles. Here, the loans are typically 15 years, 20 years, and banks' liability profiles do not exceed 3 or 5 years. So I think that's another challenge. And the last challenge in my mind is new sectors such as e-mobility and green hydrogen will need a lot of handholding till they grow mature. Quickly coming to and last is that India is overly dependent on imports in critical sectors such as solar, e-mobility, and battery storage. Let me come to solutions then, right? So first, India needs to be allocated far more capital for green aspirations. I already talked about this. Fair share of capital needs to come to India. Some money is already coming in. Much more needs to come in if our pace has to go up. And India is not seeking assistance in grants. I'm not saying grants. Much of this money could come in form of commercial and development capital in a variety of instruments, ranging from equity, debt, blended finance, guarantees, and more. Second important point is investors should invest long term. India's story is here to say, please believe in that. Set up active treasury desks in India and don't look at flipping the assets and moving out of India in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years time. India's story is for decades, and you should invest and stay here in India, and it'll reward you. It'll reward you handsomely. Second is Indo-Pacific region can play an important. Indo-Pacific region can play an important role to help deepen and widen the capital markets. We can seek help of London Stock Exchange Group and many other players, so that they encourage their key players to structure and underwrite issuances in India. Last point is make tech transfers easier, seamless, and affordable for Indian masses. I would like to conclude with the quote of famous American playwright and writer Lorraine Hansberry. She said, "This is one of the glories of man, the inventiveness of the human mind and the human spirit. Whenever life doesn't seem to give an answer, we create one." On that helpful note and on that hopeful note, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Pankaj, and thank you for making a big pitch on investment in green investments in India. And truly so, I think we have a huge potential, not only in India, but across the Indo-Pacific region. And I think the point that I mentioned that even capital-bearing funds should move into the region, which will help rebalance the green equation for the entire world. I think it's a very, very important part. I think one of the enablers which you touched upon is India's transition to low carbon economy depends on having a efficient green energy grid. And I think that's one priority. And as a country, we are all looking at the hydrogen mission and how it can pan out. And I think that's how the rest of the Indo-Pacific region will also look at how to transit into a low carbon economy. So thank you very much, Pankaj, for your comments and your insights. If I can now move to Prabuddha Acharya, Chief Sustainability Officer of the GSW Group. My pleasure in introducing Prabuddha. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chatterjee, and good evening to all of you. After listening all this finance, let me provide a steel industry perspective, one of the hard-to-abate sector. Dhruv has alluded to that, and we are listening on the cleaner technology development and the need for green finance solutions. So the global end-use demand for steel, which is expected to grow from currently 1.5 gigatons in 2019 to around 2.1 gigaton by 2050. So if you look at these projections in this sector, the estimated amount of direct CO2 emissions in 2050 from steel industry are projected to be greater than 2.5 gigaton per year in the current policy scenarios. But look, steel making is truly a global industry, and raw materials such as iron ore and scrap and the steel products, they are traded globally to large extents. So today, if you look at over 70% of global steel production takes place in Asia, and around 24% comes from the countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So the role of steel industry in Indo-Pacific region become very crucial towards decarbonizations to this sector, which will effectively contribute to a large extent to the decarbonizations of the area. Look, currently, if you look at only technically and commercially feasible way to produce steel is from iron ore and is through use of fossil fuel as a reducing agent, and that's where the hard to abate term comes. The blast furnace is the dominant technologies right now used to reduce the ore to iron. The modern blast furnace, if you look at, is continually being developed and refined, and currently operates almost close to efficiency limit of the reduction process. So therefore, to achieve significant CO2 emission reduction, an entirely new transformative approach to iron making is required. So there are several promising initiatives under development, but I'll touch upon two such technologies that would help this sector to decarbonize significantly. Those are already referred to by Dhruv, is continue making iron through blast furnace or fossil fuel reductions, combining with carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The second option is substituting hydrogen for carbon as reductant, and therefore you generate water rather than CO2. So both these technology are in its very early stage of development for large scale applications. But however, if you look at the broad deployment of this technology, these are likely to accelerate between 2030 to 2050. So we can expect to see fast mover trial and implementations of first of kinds, providing increased quantities of low carbon steel in the market towards mid 2020 globally. Now, the factor is that who is going to pay the cost. So if we use CCUS, that will be additional $100 per ton of carbon. The cost of steel through hydrogen would be around $600 to $700 per ton of steel. So the cost of steel produced per ton through blast furnace and BOF route, which is a popular route in which we make steel currently, is around $450 to $500 per ton of crude steel. So therefore, this technology to be commercially feasible, either the cost of technology should fall drastically or the cost of carbon should increase significantly. And that is where I think Dhruv touched upon on the cost of carbon need to play an important role. It is expected if you have hydrogen cost around $2 per kg and a carbon price around $86 per ton of carbon, then the hydrogen making steel is possibly compete with fossil fuel based steel production. So considering the current rate of technology development and the cost, it's very likely that hydrogen based steel making would be economically feasible around 2040 or 50. So given the long lead times required to bring this new technology to the market, so there is a climate and economic competitiveness value in starting today. So one of the most important enabler for this transition is the green finance, where huge investment are required in low carbon infrastructure enablers, such as low carbon transmission system, hydrogen pipelines, CO2 storage hubs and clusters. So these are required in a large scale. So therefore, large scale investment is required. So currently, if you look at what are the barriers, is now in terms of lack of capacity with financial institute and also a dealing between the companies and international source of green finance to assess and provide the required kind of finance in this development of breakthrough technology, in the R&D of this the breakthrough technology. So keeping in mind that producing low carbon steel will be up to 50% more costly than conventionally produced steel today, we need to enable access to finance for the transition, either through frameworks for sustainable finance, or we ensure availability and affordability of low carbon resources, including carbon capture storage infrastructure and hydrogen in quantities. These are necessary to rapidly move the greener breakthrough technology. So therefore, it is necessary that the governments, the steel industry, and other stakeholders such as investors and consumers, all we need to collaborate closely to overcome the technological and economic challenges. And we need to create the market condition necessary for the steel industry to transition to low carbon steel making effectively. So with that, I will stop here and look forward to any questions on these areas, Mr. Chatterjee. Being in the steel industry, I thought it is important to highlight the requirement of large-scale investment in the breakthrough technology to bring the necessary changes. I stop.
Thank you very much, Prabodh, to bring out the perspective on the steel industry, and which is absolutely critical, because unless the steel industry goes on a path of abatement, the equation will not get completed. So thank you very much for your insight, which I'm sure the audience would appreciate very much. Thank you, Prabodh. Thank you. May I now turn to Mr. Dipesh Shah, Head Development and International Relations, IFC in the GIFT City. May I also request my next speakers, Dipesh, Srinivas, and Anirban, to keep your comments brief, because I'm being told that we are fairly out of time. So just keep your comments brief, and thank you very much. So Dipesh, over to you.
Kaushik, I have a request.
Yes.
I'm supposed to be speaking at an event that's just starting now.
Okay.
If you permit, I will do a very short intervention and take your leave.
That's okay. If that's fine, Anirban, go ahead. I presume, Dipesh, you're okay.
Yeah, okay. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
A lot has been said already, so being brief is not very difficult. We've discussed sectors where action is required. We've discussed technologies where action is required. And we've talked about ways of funding. If we look at the whole thing together, we are essentially saying that money is required to cut two kinds of lead time. One lead time is the technology development lead time, which Prabodh Acharya just talked about. Another lead time is the new solution adoption lead time, which we usually ignore. Every new solution follows an S-curve of adoption. But it takes a lot of time to gather pace and scale. But since climate is a problem with a time limit, we cannot afford to let that lead time be what it normally is. Therefore, if we were to summarize our conversation today, it would be like saying, what are the right ways of funding to reduce the lead time of new low carbon product or solution adoption? And what are the best ways of funding to reduce or accelerate the development of technologies which we know we will need to solve the climate problem? Now, it is fair to say that green bonds cannot do this job. In fact, green bonds don't bring any advantage to to people who use green bonds, because the interest rates are all the same. Sustainability results linked bonds, which are slowly showing up now, seem to be a good idea, because it actually helps in investing in the right place to be able to have the kind of effect that we are talking about. But as we know, it is still a drop in the ocean. Carbon pricing can also help, but engagement with the carbon pricing conversation indicates that we need to simplify it a little so that people can get going by using carbon pricing in an effective manner. In fact, marrying the idea of carbon pricing and the Nobel Prize winning idea of providing nudges to trigger transformation might just give clues on how to use carbon price to trigger the transformation towards a low carbon economy. pivoting towards a low carbon trajectory is like rebooting the world while it is alive and kicking. We will only be able to do this if we scale adoption of low carbon solutions that are economically feasible today, and there are plenty of them. If I had the time, I'd tell you about some examples. Rapidly accelerate the feasibility of solutions that we know are required, and link the access to and the cost of funds to meaningful action taken. This, to my mind, was some of the key things that I heard speakers say. And I guess this is as abstract I can possibly get without getting into details. Forgive me for having to be so brief and blunt, and thank you very much for permitting me to join the next meeting.
Thank you, Anirban, and thank you for being very succinct but very focused. Thank you very much. Appreciate your points. May I now turn to Dipesh for his comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chatterjee, and thank you, my co-panelist. Today, I think I understand that we started at 5:45 and everybody is almost on the verge of closing the day. So I'll be very brief on what has been already been said. So I'm taking a liberty not to delve much on the topic which has already been covered by my expert panels on today. At the outset, I must thank the CII for organizing this first edition of Indo-Pacific Business Summit. I think it's a very timely when all of the institutions across the globe are talking on the green finance and the clean technology. This is the most appropriate time that these deliberations are happening. Or in the next few minutes, I'll just try to give a perspective on the green finance from the point of view of India's first International Financial Services Center, which is being set up at GIFT City, which incidentally is also India's first greenfield smart city. And many of the panel members may like to hear about what is happening and how it is contributed towards the green technology and green finance. I think it is India's first unified regulator which is being set up by the government of India. So we can imagine the powers of the central bank, the securities board, the insurance and the pension all vesting into one unified regulator, which in a way helps everyone to be able to efficiently come up with the new products and new solutions in a much faster space what has been required in the global markets today. In 2015, I think India took a very important and decisive step to set up the Finance Special Economic Zone in India, which was notified as India's first International Financial Services Center. So from a foreign exchange perspective or from the India perspective, this is an offshore territory. Well, it's part of India, but it's an offshore from that perspective. And it is an international jurisdiction that provides no restrictions on the capital convertibility, which means you have full capital account convertibility when you are operating from an IFFC zone. It is also becoming an important gateway for inbound and outbound financial services, particularly for developing green technology and green finance. I think in today's conversation, what is very important to understand the critical role and the crucial role that is being played by the international financial centers to develop green products in green finance. I think one of the financial experts from the LSC did mention about the platform that they provide for green listing and the green growth that's seen in the various financial fields. What we have seen as an international financial services center in a short span of 3 to 5 years as the center has grown, is we've seen almost a $77 million of transaction happening from the International Financial Services Center. Not necessarily everything from a green perspective, but it is trying to bring in a lot of transactions which were earlier not happening in India to bring it onshore, which were all happening on the offshore market. And that's what we believe that the new structures and the new market which India needs can be very well developed and tested in the International Financial Services Center for India. Perhaps the policymakers in India were aware and did visualize this, and that's why the green growth, what we are talking today, was being visualized at that time to develop through an international financial platform on the Indian soil. I believe that this could be a great game changer for India, that we want to channelize global green capital flow into India. In fact, in the medium term, I do expect the IFFC to become a major hub for raising the green capital, not just for Indian corporates, but also for the countries in the South Asian region. I think the alarming challenge of the global warming and the climate change, it does possess us both challenges and opportunities, and to come up with the innovative solutions. So let me highlight just 4 or 5 areas what has been done in the IFFC for the green finance solutions. We already have 2 international exchanges operating 22 hours a day. A lot of bonds, close to $68 billion have already been listed. We already have platform for green bond listing on these exchanges. We have 6 entities which have already raised green or social bonds from the IFFC exchanges, and a unified regulator which is also trying to bring in the solutions which are needed to enable the listing of the global bonds in the IFFC platform. We are also fully committed to ESG norms and the practices what has been followed in the global markets. And from the point of view of the technology and environment, we are focusing on green tech. We must nurture and encourage the technology startups to develop the AI and the ML solutions for the green finance. And thereby the fintech in the field of green finance will also be an encouraging platform which the IFFC is enabling. I will not go into much of the detail, as I understand we are already on the close of the day. I thank the CI once again and Mr. Chatterjee for having this deliberation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure as we are all looking forward towards the GIFT City to provide us the platform for not only conventional financing, but also in terms of green financing. And it's been a big platform for the future. And I'm sure that all corporates and companies in India, as well as in the region, will find it a alternative option to access capital from the GIFT City platform. Thank you very much, Mr. Shah, on that. Thank you. My last speaker today is Mr. Srinivas Jain, Executive Director and Chief of Strategy, SBI Funds. May I invite Srinivas for your comments? And as you know, we are pretty much out of time. So would request you to keep it brief and short. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chatterjee. And thank you for Minister of External Affairs and CI inviting us for sharing this event. And I think it's a very important event. We've also heard a lot from our esteemed co-panelists, right? They have, there are some advantages of speaking last. You don't have to repeat everything that somebody said. And you're also pressed for time. So I'll keep my points very, very brief. And I'm going to bring this whole context from a point of view of investors. So the context is that SBI Funds Management is the largest investor in India and one of the largest in Asia. We manage about $175 billion worth of assets. We have been very, very early in the ESG investing space, and we are being rewarded and recognized for our capability in that space. A significant chunk of our incremental investing is now going towards sustainability and the ESG space. Next 2-3 minutes, I'll quickly cover about the financing sources that are in India. In fact, most of my panelists already talked about pros, cons. You had a lot of interesting debate whether green bond makes sense, impact investing makes sense. So I won't go into that. But I think there are 2 key things that are happening, right? One is about, if you look at IEA's, net zero pathway, you basically think about the midterm view of renewable energy, which is solar, wind power. I think that's where I think the efficiency improvement parameters is becoming a critical part for funding, right? It's basically to see how you can move from reduced energy consumption rather than increased energy consumption. There is a lot of work that can happen in terms of efficiency building and appliances and buildings and other places. And funders are doing a lot in that particular space. But then you come to the new technology. When you really look at the 2050 kind of a long-term emission IEA pathway, there you're really looking at some really big impact investing going into carbon capture and storage, green and blue hydrogen technologies, energy storage, fuel cells. These are large, huge investments and really required focused investments. And there are a lot of projects which are still in a very, very early stage and require huge investments. But sectorally, there are a lot of interesting stuff that's happening. If you look at cement industry, there is a lot of work that's happening on pre-cleansed clay work, which requires huge funding to start with. The mining industry requires low carbon smelting technology. There is a big investment there. So when I look at individual sectors, there is already, we also come from a banking background. There's a whole lot of initiative that's happening on improving technology, and they require the conventional businesses, require funding on that. So when you really look at the whole taxonomy around this, that's, I think, where is the bigger challenge around it, right? In India, we don't have a good quality taxonomy. Apart from some green bond taxonomy, there's really no long-term taxonomy around how this can be done, right? So it's important for us to now work on those taxonomies. RBI is now moved into the Network for Green and Financial System. We've now got BRSR for 1,000 companies, at least by 2023. These are all very good early steps, but there is a lot that can be done. In fact, we as global investors and global investors investing through our stuff are bringing the best-in-class capability when it comes to investments in companies which follow best-in-class services. So we are already engaging with regulators, with the overall eco-structure to build some of these particular spaces. I don't want to talk about banking, but I think banking, despite the fact whatever people have been talking about, is going to spearhead a big change there. And I heard the talk about how public sector banks will lead this, and I don't see anybody else with any deeper source of fund can lead it. But green bonds, and more importantly, the bonds which are in the space of impact investing, are going to be a big space to look out for. One of the other things that we do quite aggressively as investors is to work on the global initiative of Climate Action 100+. In fact, CA100+ is an initiative of companies moving towards reducing corporate greenhouse gases, Paris Agreement. There are the investment management companies as part of this is about $47 trillion. It's a huge amount of money backing this initiative. And we're very happy to be India's representative there from CA100+. In fact, I'm part of that Asia group for that work. And we do a lot of work in building standardization, visibility, advocacy, especially in this climate change area, and bringing high quality capital for that. Another thing that we do very interestingly in India is the ESG mutual funds, right? ESG mutual fund is a very new category. It just started about 3-4 years ago. We were the first to launch in that category. But in a very, very short span, now we have 10 odd funds in India which invest in the ESG space. This space is now about 10,000 crores, about 100 billion rupees worth of assets. And it's growing at a very, very fast pace. We at SBI, we are almost 40% of the market segment in this particular segment. And a lot of these companies are now UN PRI signatories. There's a lot of push that's happening in terms of disclosures that's going on. One of the other things that we do very effectively, and that's important for us being a large investor, is active engagement both with investing company and the whole eco-structure on the ESG achievement metrics, right? In fact, there have been many companies we've worked to improve their rating score, not by incentivizing them, but working with them, trying to tell them how to get sources of capital. And this really helped. We work with rating agency, we work with DFIs, we work with multilateral banks jointly to make some of this help, right? Some of this actually happen. And I wanted to give some very good examples about fundraising, innovative fundraising activity that's happening. But I guess we are really running out of time. One interesting fundraising that happened, I was very impressed with the Ultratech Cement fundraising. You might have seen the kind of work that they've done in benchmarking their performance of emissions to that of interest, right? So if you see, they said that they will reduce their emission by 22% for every ton of cementinous material produced from now to 2030. And if that doesn't happen, the interest rates will be higher by 75 basis points. So that is simply one of the most innovative way for investors to think about how powerful this segment could be. I'll probably leave here. I guess there's a lot that's already been covered. I don't want to say the same thing again. But I think as we work towards more green taxonomy, high level of awareness, government and regulatory push, we can expect more green investing, innovative green investing to happen and be a significant part of the Indian economy. I will also encourage investors in India, globally, not just institutional, even retail investors, to actively consider ESG-based strategy in their portfolio and encourage such kind of funding. You have lots of opportunity for you to look up. We have a big website which talks about how to do ESG investing. I'd actively encourage investors to go and have a look at that. I think in the interest of time, I'll yield my time and go ahead with, if there is any questions, happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Srinivas. I think the fact that the risk and opportunities in the financing is what will encourage issuers to then look at it. What you mentioned for Ultratech, it's a KPI-linked bond, so therefore it kind of triggers the incentive for people to work towards that pathway. And of course, the taxonomy part is very, very critical, because unless we get that right, we will not have the strategies to implement in the future. Thank you very much. There's lots to talk about in this subject. I would like to thank all my panelists for their valuable contribution to today's discussion. I hope it's been enriching for the audience. I certainly enjoyed moderating the session. I think it is important to understand that this is a vast subject. It's an emerging subject, it's an evolving subject, and it's a very, very critical subject for us to engage as individuals, corporates, and nations to make the world a better place for the future. I thank you very much for your participation. And with this, I would like to close the session. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.